Okay.
Good afternoon, everyone. May I ask
Buenas
if
tardes.
anybody needs Spanish translation?
¿Alguien necesita de traducción al español?
No?
¿Alguien necesita de traducción al
Bueno, si
español?
alguien lo necesita, if somebody needs it, could you please
¿Alguien
raise your hands?
necesita traducción
No.
al español? ¿No necesita?
No. All right. Mr. Burr. Can you hear it? You can hear. Can you hear? Can you
Sí.
hear okay? Can you hear? Okay, great.
¿Sí?
Okay, no, we're going to start. I don't think anybody needs Spanish translation. Okay. Well, good afternoon, everybody. A very warm welcome on behalf of the Natural Governance Resource Institute. Let me start again. Good afternoon, everybody, and a very warm welcome on behalf of the Natural Resource Governance Institute and Observatório do Clima to this event on national oil companies hosted here at the WWF Pavilion on Fossil Fuel Phase-Out Day. A big thank you to WWF for your hospitality. From the start of the Leaders Summit here in Belém, both the UN Secretary General and President Lula have put fossil fuel phase-out squarely on the table. And many of you, as we are eagerly awaiting to see how that unfolds over the next few days. Our session today aims to contribute to this conversation by focusing on how national oil companies, or NOCs, can be part of this transition, and what a fair, effective, and inclusive phase-out could look like in practice. NOCs, as you know, are hugely important. They produce around half of the world's oil and gas, and that share is expected to grow as international oil companies scale back. For many low and middle income countries in the global south, these companies are actually pillars of national and local economies and major sources of revenue and employment. And that's what we are here to discuss today. At NRGI, we've been looking closely at the transition risks facing NOCs. Our research shows that about a quarter of the $1 trillion that these companies plan to invest in oil and gas between 2023 and 2032 would not break even if governments follow through on their own climate pledges. In another study from 2023, only 9 out of 21 NOCs had even acknowledged this transition risk. But at NRGI, we believe that with the right planning, governance, and support, NOCs can become engines of opportunity for a fair and inclusive energy transition instead of carriers of stranded assets. That's why we are developing a framework to help governments, company leaders, and advocates design transformation pathways that can help decision makers assess transition risk and identify new opportunities, look into how to redeploy the strengths of NOCs, be those technical, financial, logistical, and to know when others may be best placed to lead, as well as how NOCs can become better at using revenues more wisely, whether reinvesting in low carbon capabilities or channeling funds toward diversification, infrastructure, and innovation at the national level. And finally, at NRGI, we cannot talk about NOC transformation without talking about just transition. The oil sector decline is already happening and being felt more harshly in many producing regions around the world, where local economies depend on the sector. The needs and priorities of communities in the front line of the transition are very much at the center of what NRGI does. So as we finalize the framework I just described to you, this conversation is an important step for us in terms of defining the future of that work, and we very much hope that you enjoy the event that we have put together for you. So we are now going to move on to our first speaker, who is Sueli Araújo, coordinator of public policies at Observatório do Clima here in Brazil. Sueli is going to talk to us about a recent work done by her organization on Petrobras, called the Petrobras That We Want, looking at reform priorities at next steps. Please go ahead, Sueli.
We have changed, Gabi, the Petrobras we need. Observatório do Clima, Climate Observatory, is a network with 106 organizations, and we have a working group focusing the energy sector. And we have prepared a study, we have a project where we are trying to give proposals to influence Petrobras, our big oil company, change its strategic decisions related with the appliance of the investments. Our intention is to show that to begin a process with concrete proposals and not only critics that show routes for Petrobras to adjust its planning and become an energy company that can truly lead the just transition. And to do this, the idea is that Petrobras can do this reducing the oil production and focusing more sustainable energy. And we are sure that Petrobras can be other kind of company, more sustainable, without losing the importance of the country, and without losing market value. Petrobras 2025-2029 business plan projects $111 billion of investments. It's really a giant company. It's very important to note this, but in this planning, they intended to invest less than 10% of the money in sustainable energy, circa 8%. Petrobras is supporting the decision of the government to increase the oil production, is really supporting this intensively. They are really making the wrong decision. They are looking to the past when they decided this. Our most important collective proposals are to give priority to investment in low carbon sources in order to diversify the company's core business, to reallocate investments planned for new refineries to energy transition, to pursue a real reduction in the company's emissions from operations without relying on low-impact measures such as the purchase of carbon credits and carbon capture technologies, to invest in biofuels, renewable diesel, and sustainable aviation fuel, and support the decarbonization of freight logistics and passenger transport. We have a list of proposals, but we intend to follow this effort, detailing these proposals in 2026. We already begun also a campaign with a specific site And also we have begun to talk with the government, but not yet to Petrobras. They are with a big resistance when they see anything signed by the Climate Observatory. But we will try to make this effort to achieve Petrobras. We already have good meetings with other organizations of Brazilian government discussing the content of this study.
Thank you very much, Sueli. I am now going to hand over to our moderator, who is fresh off the plane from Madagascar. Let me, oh, my papers. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Ketakandriana Rafitoson, or Kay. She is Executive Director of the Resource Justice Network, a political scientist, researcher, activist, and human rights defender. She serves as Vice Chair of Transparency International's Board of Directors and is part of the advisory board of the African Women Against Corruption Network. She will now be taking over from me as your moderator for this session. Over to you, Kay.
Thank you so much, Gabi, and hello, everyone. Sorry for being late. I did my best, but I got lost in the venue. But it's a great pleasure to be here today with you and to moderate this panel on such an important topic, especially on this fossil fuel phase-out day. This is special, so that's why it is really important for us to have this conversation. I think the question that we want to discuss, and you have started already to deep dive on this, is really what happens to national oil companies as the world transitions away from fossil fuels. This is something that we want to know because national oil companies produce more than half of the world's oil and gas. They are still big players in the field. But when we are speaking about the energy transition, there should be a transformation. And this is exactly what we want to hear from you today. I won't take long because we started the discussion already, and I wanted, I don't know if, I'm sure Gabriela has already introduced the three of you, right? So I will just go to the questions then. So, not yet? All right, so only Sully. All right, so let me introduce Nafi, our second speaker. So Nafi Kwarshi is the African Director of the Natural Resource Governance Institute, and she is a seasoned international development strategist with over 20 years of experience. That's impressive, Nafi, in the international development sector and civil society. So Nafi leads NRGI's Africa strategy, partnerships, and programs on energy transition, minerals, and fossil fuel governance. And she works with government, civil society, and strategic partners to advance inclusive, equitable, and accountable resource governance. And Nafi is recognized for bridging high-level policy dialogue with on-the-ground impact and reshaping narratives on Africa's extractive sector and energy transition. So welcome, Nafi. And I'm going to briefly also introduce our third speaker, who is Baptiste Alberton, who is a political economist and postdoctoral researcher at the Tide Center from the University of Oxford in the UK. So Baptiste's research lies at the intersection of development theory and international political economy, with a specific focus on the design of green industrial policy strategies and the geoeconomics of the Anthropocene. He completed his PhD under the supervision of Ha-Joon Chang at the University of Cambridge and has also received degrees from Sciences Po in Paris. So, welcome again to the three of you, and thanks a lot for making the time to have this important conversation today. So, Sully, you had the first question. I will be back to you afterwards. But let's turn to Africa with Nafi for the moment. So, Nafi, national oil companies in Nigeria, in Ghana, and Uganda are still major fiscal anchors. We agree on that. Yet the transition risk is growing fast. So, what kind of lessons can we draw from the experiences of these African national oil companies of how these entities can navigate a managed decline while also supporting diversification and community resilience? Over to you.
Thank you very much, Kay and then Gabriela. I hope you managed to catch your breath a bit from the rush here. And so I head the Natural Resource Governance Program in Africa, and in Sub-Saharan Africa, NRGI works in 6 countries, and we focus on fossil fuel and minerals governance. This discussion goes to the very heart of Africa's economy, as Gabriela talked about, because our national oil companies are not just corporate entities. They are fiscal anchors. They are political symbols. And for many of our citizens, they represent the promise of a shared prosperity. And so that's the importance of the conversation we are going to have today. But that promise is under unprecedented strain. The world is moving faster towards decarbonization, and global oil demand is expected to peak before 2030. And financing for fossil fuels is tightening, as we know. And so for African producers that depend heavily on the oil for jobs, for revenues, foreign exchange, and the energy transition is not a distant risk. It's actually unfolding right in front of them. It's a reality. And so I would like to share perspective from 3 countries, Ghana, Uganda, and Nigeria, where we concentrate our work on the fossil fuel. And because these perspectives are interconnected. And I would like to speak about managed decline and diversification and community resilience, drawing from these 3 countries, all right? So on managed decline, in Nigeria, as we all know, Nigeria oil contributes less than 10% of GDP, but over 80% of foreign exchange, and half of government revenues, a level of dependence that is economically and physically unsustainable. That's huge for a country to just focus on one stream of revenue for developing the country. And then we also, despite the commercialization of NNPC is the Nigerian National Oil Company, and so into NNPC Limited by the Petroleum Act that was passed in 2021, it still remains, this critical oil company still remains under the control of government as a fully government-owned limited liability company. And so, yet if a sustainable energy transition is to be achieved, NNPC is expected to play a central role, in reversing Nigeria's fortunes. But with almost half of Nigeria's more than 200 million population living in extreme poverty, the task ahead is daunting. To maximize short-term value from existing assets while preparing for long-term decline. So that means for Nigeria, monetizing gas, capturing emitted methane, and planning for decommissioning aging infrastructure, but not waiting until liabilities become a national crisis. They have to start now. So, and we're also seeing the wave of NOCs divesting from Nigeria. Shell, ExxonMobil, ENI, Total Energies, and those present an opportunity to learn. However, future divestments must integrate environmental, physical, social safeguards to ensure that the legacy of pollution and mismanagement is not simply transferred to local communities. And we're already experiencing that in Nigeria. So that's the story of Nigeria. In Uganda, the challenge is a little bit different. And the Ugandan National Oil Company, created in 2015, is entering the oil era, just as the global demand, forecast to peak. It has a projection of 1.4 to 1.565 billion barrels of recoverable oil. and plans for a refinery and the eco pipeline. UNOC is a Uganda national oil company. Sits at the heart of Uganda's national development aspirations. There is so much expectation of what oil revenue will do for Uganda. It has commendably developed an ESG strategy, including methane emission reduction and planting of over 40 million trees. But it faces serious funding pressure. And then the need to borrow for its equity stake in the pipeline and refinery has increased its debt exposure. And there is a risk of locking Uganda into fossil fuel infrastructure, precisely when the world is moving away from this investment. So UNOC's dilemma illustrates a broader African question, which is how do late entrants into the oil avoid stranded assets while capturing value from resources meant to drive development? Ghana is yet another story there with a reality check, because Ghana has been producing for a while. So after, a promising start in 2010 when we discovered, by the way, I come from Ghana, when we discovered oil, production peaked at 71 million barrels in 2019 and now falling to 48 million barrels in 2024. The Ghana National Petroleum Corporation, which was established about 40 years ago, is weighed down by debt, huge debts, outdated laws, and the government owes about, and the government that owes it over 1.1 billion. So its revenues are declining and its core funding is increasing. So there's a lot of loan. It's incurring a huge loans. NNPC should rather invest in energy innovation, because that's the way to go. The case in Ghana is quite problematic. Decline is already here. Managing it responsibly requires honest accounting, transparency, which is what civil society in Ghana have been calling for, and a clear strategy of what comes next. That's what they should be planning for. So you can see that across all the three countries that I've described, there's a message that is consistent with the African NOC and that are trapped by nostalgia. Managed decline should be an intentional strategy for these countries. So on the issue of diversification, the second pillar is diversification. And here the agency is very clear. In Nigeria, they have a decade of gas initiative and an ambitious energy transition plan targeting 30% renewable by 2030. And the electricity mix remains 77% gas-based. NNPC Limited has created a new energy division integrating renewables and hydrocarbons into its portfolio. It's the right direction anyway, but implementation is still problematic. It's very problematic and deeply integrated in the national. It needs to integrate those implementation plan in the national development priority. Gas for Nigeria should not be a bridge. It's not a destination for. We have to agree on that. The bridge only works if it connects to renewables, and that's where I think that they should focus on. And in Ghana, diversification has taken a backseat. All right, GNPC has suspended its diversification plan and is doubling down on gas as a transition fuel, with about 14.5 billion in gas infrastructure plan by 2040. And while this may ensure energy security in the short term, it's risk locking Ghana into high carbon assets, because there's decline in global demand. So GNPC for us should instead be responsible, should be repositioned as a national energy company, investing in solar, storage, clean technologies to diversify its revenue streams. And while aiding the diversification of the countries, Uganda diversification could start from the design, because it's just starting and there are huge lessons to learn. The Kabelega National Park and the refinery complex could integrate renewables, green industrialization, and circular economic principles. UNOC still has the opportunity to build for the future and not for the past. And it can align its investments with the country's energy transition and the climate resilience agenda. So the lesson across the three countries is simple. Diversification is not an option. Every year of delay makes the transition costlier, riskier, and more inequitable. So the third aspect I'd like to share is on community resilience and centering people in their transition. So the third and most human dimension of community resilience, ensuring that people and places long tied to oil are not left behind. Because as I said in the beginning, now we all acknowledge people's livelihood are tied to this in the past, and now there is a shift. All right, so we need to center people in the discussion and the planning of the transition process. In Nigeria, again, the Petroleum Industry Act requires 3% of oil companies' operating expenditures to be channeled to host community development trusts. As of 2024, 70 of the 167 registered trusts are operational, all right? But many face capacity and governance challenges. For these trusts to work, NMPC must lead on transparency and ensure genuine community participation. That's not the case. That's not what we are seeing in Nigeria. Equally critical is environmental remediations as IOCs increasingly diverse, starting with the Ogoni land, where decades of degradation have eroded livelihoods. A managed decline must mean a just transition for oil-producing communities, not a cycle of neglect. In Ghana, and lastly, and then I'll wrap up.
Okay.
Declining oil revenues are already weakening, social investment, and we've seen that between 2020 and 2023. Only 47% of oil revenue earmarked for education was disbursed last year. Agriculture received less, just a quarter of its allocation. Industrial development, barely 2.5. These figures translate in stalled human capital, lost jobs, rising inequalities. So the point here, I think, is that national oil companies need to transform. All right? They need to transform. So, and then they were created to extract value from the ground. Now they must create value above it. And so I'm just trying to wrap up so that so for NNPC Limited, this means strengthening corporate and environmental governance, attracting climate-aligned finance, positioning itself as a regional energy leader rather than merely a national oil company. Ghana, it means legal and institutional reforms, updating its 1982 law, too old for value, addressing its debts and adopting a credible sustainability strategy aligned with the country's energy framework. For UNOC, it means ensuring that ESG's ambitions are fully funded, transparent, integrated into Uganda's long-term climate goals. So government also has a role to play. That is, they need to rethink oversight, benchmark NOC performance, and incentivize low-risk, future-fit investment decisions. Thank you.
Fantastic, Nafi. Thanks a lot for summarizing 3 country cases in 8 minutes. That's not an easy job, but you did it brilliantly. Thanks a lot. Now, Baptiste, I would like to hear from you. So, Tide researchers have argued that commodity sectors can serve as launchpads for broader industrial development if governments design the right industrial projects and policies. So, from your perspective, what are practical steps an oil producing country can take to turn today's NOCs led sector into tomorrow's industrial and technological base without locking in fossil dependency? Because that's important. We are trying to phase out. We don't want to create another pathway of dependency. So over to you.
Thank you very much, Kay, for the introduction, and thank you, NRGI, for the invitation to present some of our research at Tide. So what I will share today is based on very preliminary work that we are doing on NOC at Tide with Amir Lebdiwi, the director of the Tide Center, and Valérie Marcel from the New Producers for Sustainable Energy. And our point of departure was the recognition that a lot of the discussions that were happening around the question of green industrial policy and green industrialization, that is the very heart of our research at Tide, a very important framework, we believe, to link questions of economic development, with questions of environmental sustainability through diversification, productive transformation, and new export promotion, were actually quite detached from a concrete attention given to the role, the potential role NOCs could play in these processes. So the let's say like the starting point of the research has been that one. And what I want to share with you maybe today are three, what we believe are three important aspects of this discussion, of the role of NOC within green industrial policies. And the first relate with the question of institutional coordination. So across history, the history of economic development, it has been recognized that institutional coordination is absolutely key to drive processes of productive change. You need efficient and effective bureaucracies that are able to align objectives between institutions, to align policies also that are pursued horizontally between institutions and also, let's say, vertically across time. Increasingly, it is also recognized that this will be absolutely central to drive processes of decarbonization. But what we see in practice is that the concrete action NOCs take are quite detached often from the concrete design of green industrial policies at the governmental level. Often the oil and gas sector and NOCs have been operating in a silo. So what we need, in both from the perspective of the NOC and from the perspective of the national government, is to build new form of institutional collaboration and coordination that are able to align objectives. First, because the possibility of diversification for an NOC will not be possible without the help of various actions from the different ministries. Let's say, for example, an NOC wants to diversify by trying to produce more sustainable energy. This will also need to involve the action of the Ministry of the Environment, potentially of the Ministry of the Economy as well, in order to create the right incentives for this to happen. This type of coordination has been important in general for economic development, but it's even more important for this kind of transitions, we believe. A second important aspect is the question of the type of diversification that is possible to pursue. So often when we talk about NOCs and the role of NOCs for driving economic development, it is possible to identify four different types of strategies. The first one is to use rents for social programs or for driving programs or interests that are non-economic in practice. Second one is to invest more concretely in infrastructure that could benefit the productive system more generally. The third one is investment is in related sectors, so upward and downward linkages. For example, if you produce oil, to invest in petrochemicals. And the fourth one that is very important is the possibility to use NOC's revenues or the revenue for the oil and gas sector in order to invest in unrelated activities. So across history, you can also find examples of companies that starting doing something and that completely moved away from that in order to become big leaders in sectors that probably if you have told them at the time, okay, you are planning to go from here to there, that's impossible. You're not going to make it. One example is Nokia. Nokia started as a logging company, and it ended up being one of the key players in the mobile and telecommunication sector. The other one being Hyundai, for example. Hyundai started as a construction company and ended up being a leader in both first shipbuilding and then in the production of cars. So actually, we believe that is very important when you think about the role of NOCs in potentially helping to finance or in diversifying towards green sectors to avoid only thinking about the usual suspects. For example, it's not necessary for an NOC to only think about trying to move from oil and gas to green hydrogen. It's important to recognize the internal capabilities to do so, but it's also important to think about maybe ways that these companies could completely transform themselves. For example, investing in innovation on the basis of biodiversity, I don't know, or in investing in totally different sectors. So this is an important aspect as well, we believe, in thinking about the role NOCs could play in driving both economic development and more sustainable forms of economic development in the global south. A final important point that I think is also worth mentioning, and that is related with the governance of NOCs, is the question of trade-offs. It's very common as well, when you look back at history, to see that SOEs, more generally, not just NOCs, are often the object of multiple imperatives. They want to be used in order to create employment, to reduce cost of living conditions, to create more innovation. So there is no necessary imperative to only pursue one and not the other, but there needs to be clear institutional definitions of how to prioritize objectives, how to actually segment the objectives, also how to distribute the task within the company in order not to end up with one instrument that is trying to resolve everything. There are things that an NOC will not be able to do that maybe are the task of other parts of the government as well. So it can be a very powerful instrument, but it doesn't have to be the instrument that is here to solve it all. This, we believe, is very important. The type of orientation and the type of action an NOC should pursue should be open to also participatory debates. There is no necessity for this to be defined from like a top-down perspective. It has to involve more concrete bottom-up discussions, but there needs to be a strategy around what kind of objective the company pursues. And one important one being, what is the distribution between objectives that are more economically driven, that are linked with the necessity to have a profitable economic activities, and other ones that are again more linked to potentially the pursuit of social objectives or environmental objectives. And this, we believe, is a very important also dimension of the reform of the governance of NOCs. So I will stop here, and then I think we will explore other questions.
Definitely. Thanks a lot, Baptiste, for sharing the TIDE research perspective. I think it's really interesting, especially complementing what has been shared from national perspectives in Africa and Latin America, from the Brazil experience. So now I just have two small questions for the three of you, and I will give you each 2 minutes because we would like also to hear from our public out here. So you just pick whatever question suits to you. So the first one is, how can the transformation of NOCs be part, of the transformation away from fossil fuels that this COP is ambitioning to achieve? And building on that same line, what needs to happen here at COP30 in Belém that we cannot delay anymore? What has to happen now, be it, politically or financially, to support NOC transformation, especially in the global south? So just one or two quick concrete points from each of you.
Okay, I will try to talk very quickly. Working with NOC is really not easy because they have strong economic, social, political, and symbolic power with the population also. It's a challenge, but they must be part of the solution. I think they must really diversify their investments, focusing the decarbonization process. I have some critics when including some environmentalists support that the money from oil, increase of the oil production, should be direct to should be invest in energetic transition, because when we increase the production, we are worsening the problem that the transition must focus. It's a problem of logic. We cannot depend on the oil to solve our problem of emissions. It doesn't make sense. And for me, it's an important discussion to be made.
Thank you, Nafi,
Okay.
over to you.
Thank you very much. I would go for the second question, which is around what we need for COP. I think that for me, three imperatives for COP 30 here in Berlin now and beyond. As we shape the COP 30 outcomes, so three stand out for national African NOCs transformation. One is that we need to acknowledge and plan for transition risk and launch an inclusive global process to define the principles, timeline, and support for a just, orderly, and equitable transition away from fossil fuels. The era of infinite oil demand is ending. It's a reality. Denial, for me, is not a strategy. Preparedness is. Each NOC must embed transition risk into its core business planning. Two, diversify boldly and early and recognize NOC transformation as a financing priority and explore innovative funding option, for innovative funding options. Gas may be a bridge, but renewables are the destination. That's a fact. All right? And so invest now in solar. So funding, financial support for investment in solar, green energy, and green energy alternatives and innovation to build resilience for the post-oil economy. As I said, switching off the plug now is going to deny millions of Africans of livelihood, and this has to be managed in a way that supports them. Number three for me is anchoring the transition in people. All right? So we need to create a global mechanism for just transition at COP30 to coordinate support for workers and communities and link fossil fuels and minerals transitions. Communities, workers, and future generation must be at the heart of this shift. The just transition must not be Africa's transition. One that safeguards livelihoods, restores environment, empowers citizens. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks for putting the people in the center of the discussion, Nafi. Baptiste?
Yeah, so I will not be as creative as Nafi and only propose one, but that I hope will be complementary. I think one of the key problem of just thinking about the transition from fossil fuels to renewable energies is that we are talking about very different economic models. One that is generative of a lot of revenues for the state that then potentially is able to sustain social programs again or economic diversification programs as well, from another one that is much less profitable. And that's a real political question. That's why I try to emphasize also in my presentation the necessity to try to invest in diversification, not in terms of energy diversification, but in terms of productive diversification. And on that aspect, I believe that one of the key necessity today is also to try to think about more dialogue and, is it working? Yeah. Dialogue and cooperation between NOCs, in particular at the regional level, because maybe one NOC will not able to alone be able to finance the development of a new sector at the national level. Maybe it's going to be too much investment. Maybe the competition will be too high. The barriers to entry will be too important. But by joining efforts, NOCs could potentially find new ways to diversify more quickly and more powerfully, with bigger also development dividend for the rest of the economy. I'm just taking an example, but it's not from the NOC world, but when Airbus in Europe was funded, it was funded through the cooperation and coordination of various productive actors to pursue a goal that would not have been possible for only one company to do, to compete, for example, in that case, with US aircraft manufacturers from the European standpoint. Maybe NOCs could have that same kind of strategic thinking as well, to say like, we need to productively diversify, but we will not alone be able to kickstart a new solar panel production line in our country alone because the competition is just too high. Maybe we need to cooperate in order to level up the kind of productive ambitions we can have as well. So I would be very keen to see more of this dialogue, cooperation aspect between NOCs as well.
Yeah, I think it's a need because this is also a multi-stakeholder approach, as the three of you highlighted. Each actor has a role to play in this, may be the industry, but also the government, communities as well, academia people, and civil society all together. Now I'd like to give the chance to the floor to ask two quick questions before we have to wrap up in 8 minutes. So, anyone? Yes. Let's start with the lady, and then we have the two wonderful people in the back there.
Hi. Very good talks. Thank you so much for your contributions. First off, I worked in the oil and gas industry, and now I work in renewable energy. I think the challenge with NOCs is that they haven't been challenged enough. They've made billions of dollars off the economy. They've caused significant damage to the environment. Yes, they employ people, but I don't think there's any coordination or cooperation there. The cooperation that I've seen, where there's been investments in renewable energy, they often pull out. You know, the numbers aren't quite as good enough for them, whatever the case may be, but they haven't made those commitments that are necessary for cleaning up the plastics, cleaning up the environmental devastation. You know, all these companies should have that responsibility from day one. They were never kept responsible from 1910 to 2000. Now they're slowly becoming more responsible, but anytime they're working in third world nations, they don't hold up those responsibilities. So I'm disappointed in the NOCs that they haven't stepped up in terms of the devastation they've caused.
Thank you so much, and this is what we need to change. And we had some ideas, shared here in the panel on how to speed up that change. Tamika and then Maurice. Ladies first.
Thank you, Kay. And really, this is a very interesting discussion. I come from Zambia, where our situation is reversed. We have energy transition minerals. So I am thinking, if it was the other way around, I think the devastation to economies that Nafi alluded to is really real. And so my question to the panel is, when you look at NOCs, which are mostly state-owned enterprises, right? To what extent do we, as a panel, think that governance issues and challenges are actually undermining diversification, and what could be the recommendations? I think Baptiste gave a number of examples, Nokia and Hyundai, but I assume those companies were a bit more agile, governed differently. So I'm just wondering, to what extent can we use those case studies in the African or Latin American experience? Thanks.
Thank you, Tamika. Maurice?
Thank you so much. Great conversation. Thanks to all the panelists. I think as we're having this discussion, I just want to throw in something around, what I can call maybe the elephant in the room. We know that the US is a very big factor when it comes to this issue, also given their energy consumption levels. But we also know that, the Trump administration is not really, hasn't come to the party, so to speak. And in many ways, I think they have sort of receded their leadership role. The US has receded its leadership role in this particular issue. So I'm just wondering, and I would like to get the perspective of each of the panelists, what do you think this has done to this global cause, this very good global cause? And how do you see this dynamic playing out, maybe over the next, 5, 10 years or thereabout? What has the US position done to this cause? Thank you.
Very timely question. Thank you. So, guys, I'll give you 1 minute each just to sum up and also wrap up your intervention. So, Soleil?
Okay. I think the NOC has special characteristics. They are more linked to the government. And then, in my opinion, we have a lack of public policy when we talk, especially in the case of Petrobras. Petrobras is treated like a private company in the reality. We should have more decisions, in my opinion, within the energy policy, the environmental policy, and these decisions should give more directives to what Petrobras should do, and not the only logic that is being applied nowadays is the logic of the market, the logic of the investor, and the logic of the government, but looking for the money and not for the public policy.
So regarding the question of the U.S., I mean, two things. First, the transition will happen at a moment or another. Like it's a fact. It will happen, whether or not Trump is there. And I mean, in particular in the global South, I think that it's a good news in the sense that it forces the discussion of the diversification in terms of productive activities to happen. It's not a good thing to be relying on one sector so big for an economy. Like we all know this. So this imperative still needs to be driving also process for government to think long term. First, because the Trump administration will pass probably, eventually. Second, because again, like it aligns with development ambitions as well. Diversification should have always been around the corner and like one key objective, regardless even of the sustainability imperative. The sustainability imperative only reinforces it. So I mean, this I think is an important point. Regarding then the governance, the problem is there is a lack. So governance have tended to be quite ineffective at doing industrial policy, at disciplining domestic actors, and in particular in the oil and gas sector. When you have major rents and major profitability, the necessity to be effective or efficient in the way you operate is not so great, actually. So often it has been one of the reasons that has allowed this company to operate in a very kind of easy environment. So this is an absolutely strategic task for government to acquire the capacity to, again, I mentioned coordination, but to have a strategic vision that is able also for the state to discipline the oil and gas sector, to force it to innovate, to invest in innovation, to force it to be one of the key actors driving the more general transformation process, whether economic transformation or energy transition as well. There is a need to have that disciplining capacity. And just to mention on Hyundai and Nokia, at the time of when this transition happened, these countries were not where they are today. They were actually at GDP per capita level that are similar to many countries in Africa or Latin America. So it's not a reason to not consider this example as actually telling for even for developing countries today. So I would just say like, the ambition needs to be high. These are possibilities. There are obstacles, it's difficult, but there are possibilities to diversify strategically.
Should I? If you don't have time. Okay. So thank you very much. I mean, I think that I agree with what my colleagues have said. The issue, Tammy? Yeah. I think NOCs are very powerful. That's one thing we should note, that our governments have absolute control over their operations. And so they have so much power. What we need to do is to push for reforms, governance reforms in the sector to change the agenda of NOCs. That needs to happen. You know, I cited the outdated law governing GNPC, for example. You cannot have a national oil company that is ruled by over 40 years law. The sector has changed. A lot of things have changed. We need to reform it, all right? And it's for us, civil society and civic actors, who need to push this agenda. Lastly, I think I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much to the three of you for your brilliant points and sharing, those various, diverse, but complementary, complementing each other points of view. What we heard is that governance matters, but also putting people in the center, connecting industrial policy with the energy transition, ensuring also that national oil companies really evolve in a fast way because the transition is happening now. We can't afford delays anymore. Delay is not an option. And I wanted to just share, something I was thinking for, one of you mentioned the bridge, like adding gas on top of oil, but the so-called gas bridge isn't a bridge for me. It's a cul-de-sac, as we say in French. We don't cross the emissions canyon. We pour more concrete on the wrong side if we are doing that. And we build a second factory there. So we have to make change now. And Nafia, you were speaking about the need for having a mechanism to foster all of this. And this is what we are all demanding for in this COP30, creating a global mechanism for just transition, which is the Belém action mechanism. Let's all stand for the BAM. Let's make a difference. Thanks again to NRGI. Thank you. To NRGI and Observatório, the Clima, for organizing this important conversation. Thank you.